So we're celebrating our 140th anniversary of the launch of Amateur Photographer in 1884 at the moment, and to celebrate that we're looking back at all the landmark cameras that have been released since AP has been produced, which is 140 years. We're focusing particularly on the 20th century, and in this video we're looking at cameras post-war, so cameras that came out after the Second World War up until the millennium. So John, we've got a collection of cameras here, and where are we going to start?
I think we'll start with this, because this really was born out of the war, if anything. The story is that in 1940, a German reconnaissance aircraft crash-landed in Sweden.
Right.
And people ransacked the wreckage, etc. And the government found a camera, which they took to an engineer called Victor Hasselblad, and said to Hasselblad, "This looks good. Can you make one like this?" And his reputed replied, "No, but I can make a better one."
Right.
And he did. And
do we know what the German camera was?
No, nobody knows what it is. It might have been something called a hand camera with a K in the middle of it, something like that, of which I do have a picture, but nobody knows what it is. But what we do know is that Hasselblad produced something called the HK9, which was a military camera for the Hasselblad, took 80mm film, very, very rugged. And he produced quite a lot of cameras for the Swedish military. After the war, of course, he turned his attention to producing civilian cameras, and he produced Hasselblad. And the first one he produced was a 1600F, and this is a 1600F.
Okay.
Which is a very, very, very nice camera. Now, it wasn't the first camera, it wasn't the first reflex to take 2 1/4 square pictures. What it was the first modular camera to do it. And the big thing of Hasselblad was, if we first of all open the hood, is it's modular. And I have to remember I can do this. So, of course, the lens came off. And if you hold it in a certain way and do the right thing, then the film chamber comes off. And if you press here, so I should show it first, just a better way. Then the viewfinder comes off. So it was a modular camera. That's
also, the winding knob comes off, and you could get one with a crank on it, can't you?
You could indeed, yes. But basically, that was the camera to which you fitted different lenses, different viewfinders, different camera backs, etc., different screens, and that's what made it so popular. So that is the 1600F, which was the first camera, and so called because it had a top shutter speed of 1600ths of a second, and was a focal plane shutter. Shortly after, they produced one with a top shutter speed of 1,000th of a second, and still the focal plane shutter, and that was called the 1000F. And then they went over to putting the shutters in the lenses, and I think the first one was the 500C CM, something
500C, then the 500CM.
That's right.
Interestingly, I used a 500CM for donkey's years as a daily camera, and it looks identical to that. So I guess that the main difference is the leaf shutter, not the focal plane shutter. The 500, I presume, is because that was a 500th of a second.
Yes. So after that, I lose count, but I don't know greatly about Hasselblad because I don't have one. So luckily, I have a friend who loaned me this for the sake of us showing this today. But there you are. There is.
And these cameras, I mean, when digital first became really, really popular, you couldn't give these things away.
No.
But now, they fetch a fortune. They absolutely fetch an absolute fortune. Yeah. And they're because they're such beautifully made cameras, aren't they? I mean, they are absolutely exquisite cameras to use.
They are.
Yeah. Lovely. Beautiful camera. And the fact that there are so many of these cameras still being used and working absolutely fine today. It shows they were bulletproof, weren't they? They were
absolutely.
You have to be careful with the order of taking the dark slide out and winding on, and because you could jam them up, couldn't you, a little bit?
Yes.
Cocking the lens.
I have a copy of that in Russia called the Zenith 80.
Right, of course, yeah.
And if you have to do everything in the right order, if you don't, you've had it. Everything jams up.
Yeah. Fantastic. Love this camera.
So the 1600F was the first Hasselblad, and that was 1948.
48?
Yeah.
Okay.
also in 1948.
It doesn't, just to say, it doesn't feel like a camera made in... Not many things made in 1948
No,
that
like
you can
that,
pick
or
up
feel
today
like that.
and still use now without any modification.
No, and wouldn't really look as streamlined and as aesthetically lovely as that.
Yes.
It's a lovely piece of work.
And you can get a digital back to put on that 548 Canon and still use that and shoot digitally with it if you want to.
If you're happy to remortgage your house to get it, that's the only thing. Yeah. This is one of the things I regret about modern cameras is they say, oh, this is a medium format camera. Well, fine, it's a 35mm camera that's got a bigger sensor in it.
Yeah.
Medium format cameras to me look like that. Yeah.
Okay, where are we next?
Well, going from the streamlined beauty, we can go to the downright ugly, I suppose, but a real landmark. This is the first Polaroid, also in 1948. And the story goes, some say it's apocryphal, but I think I've got proof it was true, which I'll tell you, is that Edwin Land, who's got to be one of the true geniuses of the 20th century, was in his back garden in 1946-ish, took some pictures of his young daughter, who got upset and said, Daddy, why can't I see the pictures that you've just taken? And that started him thinking about making an instant picture camera. Now, a lot of people would say this is apocryphal, it might have happened, it might not have happened, but I'll tell you this. In 1980-something, Land came to this country and refused to speak to any journalists apart from Geoffrey Crawley, whose name you might know.
Yes, an ex-amateur photographer columnist.
And also ex-editor of the British Journal of Photography.
Yeah.
And Crawley interviewed him that time extensively and wrote 4 issues of the BJ for that. And he told that story. Now, if he'd interviewed Land and he told that story, as far as I'm concerned, that's the truth.
Yeah.
Anyway, I digress. This is the first one. And as you see, it looks a little like an old folding camera from those times, but a lot bigger.
Yeah.
And all we have to do is to remember how to open it, which I worked out last night, and now I've forgotten again. Here we go. We press this. And the back opens like that. And then opens like this. And it took twin rolls of film. One went in there, one went in there. The two came together, sandwiched, and came out through a slot.
So there were rolls then at the time?
They were two rolls of film. And after the picture had been taken, we then had to open a little door in it. And you put a tab here. The 2 rolls would be sandwiched together. The negative, there were pods of chemicals in the roll of film. They burst, rolled and spread the chemicals over the surface and developed a negative. That then transformed somehow the silver salts, then went across into the positive layer and made a positive. And within 60 seconds, you could open the back, tear it off and take a print out of there. And no one had seen such a thing before. So there were cameras before that which could take pictures and produce a result in about 3 minutes if you were lucky, 5 minutes on a good day. But this was really the first time anyone had produced a truly instant picture camera.
That's amazing, because now we take for granted with phones, and digital, that you can get you see your picture straight away.
Yes.
But at the time, that must have been an absolute revelation.
Absolutely. And in some ways, that was Polaroid's downfall. When digital came along, Polaroid said, yes, but we've got instant pictures. We're Polaroid.
Yeah.
And
that complacency,
yes,
Kodak and Polaroid could get together and have a...
Kodak as well, yeah. And commiserate with one another.
Yeah.
But Land was, we could spend the rest of the afternoon talking about Polaroid cameras.
And again, that's made a comeback, because even though we've got digital,
yes,
Instax and Polaroid now are more popular than they've been probably since
Yeah. And of course, Fujifilm weren't allowed to do anything in the days when Polaroid was around.
No.
But
and of course, Kodak had their own version of this before, just to take off the market, didn't they?
They had a version was called PR10. Polaroid went on to produce the SX70 system, which was when the print ejected from the front automatically, and Kodak had a version of that. The first cameras you had to wind it out with a handle, but later it ejected. And it was called PR10 again, and it was better. It was much nicer pictures.
Polaroid, right?
But Polaroid weren't very happy about it, and they sued them for infringement of copyright.
And they won, didn't they?
And they won. It took 14 years, I think. 14 years went through, and they won. And Kodak were ordered to take all their instant picture cameras off the market, which they did. So you would think that Kodak instant picture cameras now must be big collector's items.
No? Do you know what? I bet they will be one day. So this is the time to buy them, I guess. So nobody wants them.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, what have we got next?
So that's 1948. I think we're going to stay in 1948 with the Nikon 1. So Nippon Kogaku, is that how you pronounce it? Company in Japan. After the war, they were still under American occupation, etc. But they decided to produce a quality camera. And at that time, the two big cameras on the market for 35mm were Contax and Leica. So they took both and they pulled them apart and they got the best of both. This isn't, I've got to admit, a Nikon 1. It's a Nikon S, which came 2 models later. I haven't got Nikon Win. But to all intents and purposes, it's the same sort of camera, different format. And they produce this. It looks like, if you know anything about the Contax cameras, it looks like a Contax 2. And a lot of people say, oh, it's a copy of Contax 2. And it wasn't. It was very different. The Contax had a metal focal plane shutter. This took Leica's horizontal cloth plane shutter. It took the best of both worlds.
Okay.
It just happened to look like the Contax. And so this was the first... Nikon 1 was the first. The Nikon 1 had a film format of 24 by 32mm, which they thought was a good idea because you could get more into a roll at the time when film was very expensive. And also 24 by 32 scales up to 10 by 8 paper,
right? Okay.
Which 24 by 36 doesn't.
No.
Then they produced the Nikon M, which went to 24 by 34, and then they produced the S, which is 24 by 36. So this is really the camera.
You can't even join them.
Yeah, this is what really.
So this was the
really
35mm one. Sorry, 24 by 36.
That's 24 by 36. And at about this time, so this is 1948. 2 years later, the Korean War broke out. Correspondents from all over the world flocked to Korea, stopped off in Japan on the way, and came across these. And not only that, the lenses. And they found they were going there with their Contaxes and finding Japanese Nikon lenses, which were even better than their Zeiss lenses.
Right.
And that, again, is what helped.
And they fit the...
and it fits. It's the same bayonet mount. But that is a lovely little camera.
So it was Nikon were the Japanese brand to break out of Japan into the sort of...
Yeah, they were the first mainstream. Yeah, they were very much so. Well, of course, the Nikon F, which we might talk about.
The Japanese camera invasion.
Yeah, but it's got the same as Contax. It's got focusing on a little wheel on the top there. And, well, it's a very nice camera.
I like the focusing wheel. That's pretty slick. Yeah. You said the Contax had this as well?
Yes, it did. Yes. So they just took the best of both worlds.
Mm.
And I think it had a wider base rangefinder than the Leica as well, which, of course, the wider the base, the more accurate it is.
Yeah.
Are they?
Oh, yeah. Still focuses nice and easily now.
Yeah.
Okay.
So that brings us to 1954, where one of the most beautiful cameras ever made arrived, and this is the Leica M3. Now, until then, Leica had continued the kind of design that they had with the Leica 1 way back in 1925. There were obviously improvements, they were better. A few gizmos on them, had rangefinders which were built in, but it was the same basic design. In 1954, Leica took a completely rethink and produced this. They got rid of the screw mount and replaced it with a bayonet. They widened the rangefinder base, which made it more accurate. Gave a much easier way of loading the film and just generally streamlined it. And the early cameras, which this is one,
wind it twice, didn't you?
was a double wind. The later cameras weren't. The early cameras have a glass pressure plate. The later ones didn't. So I'm talking like a collector now. But there we are. Still got the pull-out lens. Still got the focusing much the same way. But all in all, it has to be said, one of the rare beauties.
And this also, again, if you've got even the latest Leica M cameras, the M10, M11, one of the cameras, it's basically, this is the design, it's not changed, is it?
That's right, yeah.
It's absolutely fantastic.
Yeah, it's got an M10 digital camera.
Yeah. And I used one of these a lot, well, not the M3, the M4, but it's a slightly next evolution. But there's something about using these which you kind of can't appreciate till you use it. To those who aren't initiated, they're like, I don't get it.
Yeah.
When you use it, you get it.
Pick it up.
Yeah. It's a really lovely, lovely camera. And it just feels so nicely, beautifully made. Yeah. Fantastic. Okay.
So we're still in the 50s. If we go on to 1959, up until this time, border trade restrictions had been in place in the UK to prevent the import of certain luxury goods, among which were cameras. Round about this time, they began to be relaxed, and so Japanese cameras were allowed into the market, and Nikon arrived with the Nikon F. And that was the end, basically, for German SLRs, whatever. It did the job better, and it did the job cheaper. That was in 59. This particular model, which we've got here, comes from a couple of years later, 1962, when they added this, which is called the photomic head.
The standard head was much smaller.
It's just a standard prism viewfinder, or you could put a waste level finder on it. And what this did was it coupled there to the shutter speed. And under there you can just about see there's a little fork which couples the meter to the aperture ring. So the camera always knows what shutter speed and what aperture you're using. And then it was just quite simple match needle metering. And that, of course, especially with the photomic head, really became the workhorse of professional photographers. That was the Vietnam camera, basically.
And this was the camera which made the SLR the default, as opposed to the rangefinder.
Yes, because until then, rangefinder cameras like this, they ruled the roost. So what it did, it put the final nail in the coffin for rangefinder cameras and what was left of the German SLR market. And after that, of course, I mean, that's Nikon. After that came Pentax, Minolta, Olympus, Topcon, whatever, all the Japanese SLRs. And the 1960s was the decade of the 35mm SLR. All started.
Did the mechanical clockwork era, and then they became electronic, as we discussed in one of our other videos.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, it's interesting the way the decades were divided up. You know, this particular decade, the 60s, were all mechanical. And at the end of it, suddenly, electronics came in, and that put the kibosh on these.
Yeah.
What, of course, is interesting is it meant that cameras like this were immediately devalued. Nobody wanted them until now. And now suddenly people are seeing the...
Yeah. I guess with mechanical cameras, less to go wrong. And there's, they just, if they're well made in the first place, they just go on and on, don't they?
Absolutely. Well, I mean, I also collect early digital cameras, and I've taken it for granted they probably don't work.
Yeah.
And if I'm lucky, they do. Whereas things like this, I'll be surprised if they don't.
Yeah. That's great. And this obviously not only led to sort of DSLR being the default camera, I guess, but also led to Nikon's dominance of the professional market for decades.
Oh, absolutely.
Until the late 80s, and Canon sort of...
Absolutely, yeah.
Took them.
Yeah. Right, 63. We come to another landmark with Topcon. I mean, Topcon was one of those companies which really produced some wonderful cameras, but I don't know, did they not have the marketing? I don't know, but they faded away as the likes of Canon, Minolta, Nikon, Pentax, Olympus took over. The thing that makes this different, I mean, it's an SLR with interchangeable finders, various accessories for it, etc., various lenses, but what makes it different is it's the first 35mm SLR with through-the-lens metering. Not the first Canon. There was a little sub-miniature called the Mech, I forgot what it's called, Mech SB, I think it's called, but a little sub-miniature 16mm camera, which, strangely enough, was the first with through-the-lens metering, but this was the first to do it properly with in an SLR. And the way it did it is, if you look at the mirror, you'll see it's etched with lines, and each of those lines is transparent, so the light hits the mirror in the usual way, but it also goes through the mirror to a metering cell behind it, and so in that way it gives us through the lens metering, which you can read as a match needle in the viewfinder.
It's an unusual, especially the prism on the top is an unusual shape, but I like it.
I do, yes.
It's stylish, isn't it?
Yeah. Oh, there we are.
What's the appendage on the top corner there? And that's just the for flash shoe.
So that's the rewind knob.
Right.
It's got no accessory shoe.
So just stuck it on there.
But that bay image onto it.
The etchings, you can't see any etchings. There's no sign
you
of
can't
that
see
on
it there.
the viewfinder. No.
Well,
So,
of course, as you're looking at it there, of course, it's totally out of focus. To you.
Yeah. So it's not, it just doesn't affect your viewing at all. Shutter button on the front.
Yes, which I've always liked. Because as you release the button, you're pulling it back towards you instead of pushing it down. So it makes for a much steadier.
The wind is so smooth.
It is, isn't it?
Really smooth.
Yeah, so Topcon made some good cameras.
Yeah. Very nice.
But they faded away. I went the way of all things.
And it looks surprisingly modern. The lens looks surprisingly modern. If this was a brand new lens just launched now, you wouldn't think it was out of place.
Yeah, it's good. So that's 63. Also in 1963 comes the other end of the scale, if you like, as far as simplicity or mechanical is concerned, with the first Instamatic, first Kodak.
63.
Instamatic, 63,
Okay.
yeah. Thing was that photography had become quite easy now for people who didn't know much about photography. A certain amount of automation, there's no autofocus yet, but people with a minimum of knowledge could still use a camera.
Oh.
What they couldn't do was load the film. The number of people who would go into their local camera dealer or the local chemist and say, can you take this film out and put a new one in for me? And Kodak jumped into this market with the Instamatic range, which took a film in a plastic cartridge called a Kodak cartridge. And once you open the camera, there's not one in here, I know, but you took the Kodak cartridge and put it in, and it would only go in one way. And you put it in there, shut the back, and off you go. And that simplified film loading, and that really did it for Kodak. And of course, there were so many Instamatic cameras. For the next decade, they really dominated the snapshot market. And they got quite sophisticated. I've got them with built-in clockwork motor drives and meters, etc., etc.
This is another name that's become a generic.
Yes.
Any point-and-shoot camera is an Instamatic, isn't it?
Absolutely. Much to the annoyance, I think, of Kodak. If you ever referred to, when I was a photographic journalist many years ago, if I referred to an Agfa Instamatic, I immediately got a very filthy letter from the PRs at Kodak.
Really? You didn't have to be flattered, wouldn't you?
Yeah.
Their brand name has become
And likewise, we were never allowed to say Instamatic. We always had to say Kodak Instamatic.
Right.
And
it's a bit misleading because the Insta implies it's an instant camera.
Yes.
There's nothing instant about
this is it. Why didn't Edwin Land call that an Instamatic?
Yeah.
Do you know why?
No.
His first love was not cameras. He left Harvard, I think he went to, in the middle of the course, couldn't take it anymore, decided to set off on his own, and found a way to produce polarising materials. He was walking along Broadway one night, getting dazzled by all the lights coming the other way. And he thought, if we had polarising material on the headlights and polarising it on the windscreen at opposing angles to each other, you cut down the dazzle. And so he produced a polarising material in sheet form. And he called the company the Polaroid Company.
So they did that before he brought the camera.
So when he had a camera, he called it a Polaroid. But really, you'd expect it to be called an Insta camera.
And that explains the other big business that Polaroid had was the glass sunglasses.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay.
Absolutely. So, so you'd expect it to be called an Insta camera or an Instamatic even before these days. But there you go. One of the little things about the photographic trade. Now, what Kodak was always very good at was producing something like the Instamatic and then getting everybody to buy the film for their Instamatic cameras, but more so allowing all the other companies to tool up and produce their own versions. And the more they produce, the more Agfa produce or Minolta produce or whatever, the more film Kodak sold. And they got that to a saturation point, and then they cancelled it all and produced so that's 63. This is 72. This is the Pocket Instamatic. And this was the first 110 camera.
Right.
Same theory, basically. A cartridge that you dropped in the back, but on 16mm wide film with two cartridges.
They're much smaller film.
Yeah, much smaller film. And they produced that. So they went 63, 72, and of course, immediately did that. All the world began to tool up to produce 110 cameras. Kodak sold more film.
Kodak made its money from selling film, didn't it?
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, a point we'll come to in a moment. And so there. So that jogged along for another 10
What
years.
was the dimensions? What was the drop in dimensions? Because I remember 110 cameras as being terrible, the quality being, the picture quality being, legs are so small. Obviously, they're still bigger than the average smartphone camera sensor.
Yes, so goes the technology. But no, you're absolutely right. But of course, I suppose the film wasn't as good in those days as now. But it worked. It worked.
And the average person can't see that quality. They think it's fine.
Well, they only want imprints. Yeah. So, well, they did in those days. Now, these days they didn't. So, having done that twice, in 1982 they did it again. And they produced a disc camera. And they thought, this is a jolly wheeze. Everyone now buy Kodak disc films. And they all tooled up to make disc cameras. But they never caught on in quite the same way.
Did they?
No. And I've got some really nice disc cameras. They're good at that.
Were the legs smaller on that even than 110?
Yeah.
They were, weren't they?
Oh, yeah, absolutely minute size.
Yeah.
The disc goes in there, takes 15 pictures, little tiny pictures, and with each one, it rotates. And that's the 4000. That was the first, and I know I can tell you that for certain because that was given to me at the press conference where they launched it.
Oh, that was disc, okay.
Yeah.
This was 82.
Yeah. It was quite interesting. When they launched this, they had a press conference at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, which was unheard of. You know yourself that press conferences usually happen around about midday. Everyone had a good lunch out of it. They did it at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, so it would be midday in America and late night in Japan. And nobody knew what they were launching. We'd all heard it was something special. And we'd heard the word disc and we thought it was going to be a digital camera. And we all turned up and it was this nasty thing. But there you go. But a lot of them, I mean, I've got a Minolta that's got a stick that extends like that. And the idea was you could hold it above crowds, but you could also take selfies, as we know them today. So,
wow, okay.
They were good stuff. So, where are we?
The disc camera, okay.
Let's go to 1977. This is a landmark, if ever I saw one. This is a Konica. Again, Konica, like Topcon, they were a good company, but they didn't make it through. And this...
Oh, well, I guess kind of Konica ended up merging or buying Minolta, which then got bought by Sony.
Yeah.
So I guess now they're in an indirect kind of way. Some of the Konica engineers are probably responsible for some of the alphas.
Probably right, yes. But this was the first autofocus camera, and it was launched in 1977. It worked by something that they called, I don't know if it's official or not, but they called it solid state triangulation.
Right.
It worked with two mirrors, like a traditional rangefinder. One was stationary, one moved, and projected its image onto a sensor. And when the two images coincided, the sensor recognised that as the point of maximum contrast and set the lens. While that was happening, the lens was travelling from infinity back to close focusing. It stopped it in its tracks.
Okay.
Made it autofocus. So that was the first autofocus camera. And the first autofocus single lens reflex of all places came from Polaroid. And that's a Polaroid, they called it the Polaroid SX70 Sonar autofocus. And this produced an autofocus image by emitting a sonic beam from there, which would go out, hit you, come back. It would hear it, recognise the distance and set the...
You could hear it,
set the lens, yeah. I couldn't hear it.
Perhaps the dogs and cats.
Maybe dogs could hear it. I don't know, but that actually didn't go anywhere. But it did produce the first single lens reflex.
And the fact that it folded flat was quite a clever bit of engineering, isn't it?
Oh yes, absolutely, yeah. So autofocus started with independent lenses, which bolted onto manual focus cameras with all the mechanisms in the lens. Ricoh produced the first, and then for K-mount, then Canon came in with their FD mount, and shit on, etc., etc. But the first company to really produce a camera and lens designed for autofocus was Pentax. And that was it, the ME-F. The thing that I've learnt about early autofocus lenses is you're very lucky if they work, and they usually don't, and this doesn't. Right. So there you go. But it's a fine-looking camera. If you remember the ME Super, you'll recognise the top plate. It's an adapted version of that.
Right.
And it produced an autofocus image by pressing one of those buttons once you switched it on. Loaded it.
So the autofocus, you'd have to press the button on the lens.
Yeah, on the lens. Later, there's an Olympus OM30, which also produced an autofocus lens, and you got that through first pressure on the shutter dial, which is more thing.
And what year was this?
This is 1980 something that I've written down over here. This is 81.
Okay.
This is 81. So, in its time, it was remarkable, and Nikon did one as well. So, but the world was taken completely aback in 1985 when Minolta did this. So what they did for the first time is they took the autofocus out of the lens and put it into the body. So it's the first body integral autofocus. And unlike so many of my cameras, it actually works.
The noise.
Yeah. So it's the usual camera of its time insofar as it's autofilm wide, auto exposure, etc., etc. But it produced an autofocus image with the mechanism in the body rather than in the lens. So that was.
I do remember when this came out and seeing someone have one and think, oh, can I have a play with it? If you own one of these, you'd be constantly perceived by people wanting to see, oh, is that a Minolta something? Can I have a play? Can I have a play? And it was like sci-fi, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Wow, you press the button and the lens focuses.
Yeah. I remember going to Photokina and Nikon had an autofocus version of the F4 or something like that. And there's, point it down there and press that button. And I couldn't believe it. I was looking through the viewfinder and everything came into focus.
Yeah, they've got a lot quieter since then.
Yes, they have.
And faster.
Yeah. So that is 85. If we want to jog back just a little bit to 1975, that was the year that Kodak launched the greatest landmark never seen. Because in that year, a man called Stephen Sasson, who was one of their engineers, had worked for the company for a couple of years, and someone said to him when he first arrived, see if you can produce a camera which will retain an image on a charge-coupled device. CCDs had already been discovered, but they never got a picture on it. And he worked for 2 years, and he produced the first digital camera. And it looked a bit like a toaster. And it recorded its images on a cassette tape. And he plundered the lens from a Super 8 camera, all sorts of things. And so basically, in 1975, he went to all his bosses and he said, look, chaps, I've produced a camera which will never need film and never need processing. And all the boffins went, hey, that's a great idea, Steve. Yeah. And all the accountants went, hang on, what did Kodak make all their money from? And so they buried it. And so digital photography died at that point. And what it needed was a company with no photographic affiliations come along, and that was Sony originally. And they produced a prototype of the first Mavica, which I think I might have seen at Photokina once, and that was it. Never seen another one. We could talk for the rest of this video about early digital, but we're not going to. There was a load of, when it all started, a load of different cameras. But probably the first camera which was sold commercially as a digital camera, which it isn't, is the Canon Ion. I say it's not a digital camera because what it is, it's a video camera, a still video camera, which records the same image over and over again on a disc, and then you play it back on a TV screen. But it's quite a neat little camera. And
this was I worked for Canon briefly, and I used to do technical support on these cameras. 9 times out of 10, the questions were not about the camera; they were about the computer and how to connect it and how what to do with the pictures. But yeah, still video. So it was, as you say, not digital, but it took still video, like a freeze frame on a video, basically.
It was the first time that we got anything which commercially available, which you could almost call
Yeah.
a digital image. So after that, obviously, there were a multitude, a plethora of like compact digital cameras, which we're not going to go into at this stage. But the holy grail, of course, was to get a digital single lens reflex, a DSLR. And originally, what happened was various manufacturers came together to adapt a still camera. Nikon here got together with Kodak. So this is actually a Nikon N90 with a Kodak sensor on the back, a hard disk in there, etc., etc. I don't know how many megapixels it was. I suspect it was about 1.5, something like that.
Yeah, not very many.
So that was a very early form of digital SLR.
And all the Nikon, Canon, Fuji, they all, and Minolta, they all had versions of this, didn't they? Working with either Kodak or Fuji.
And Nikon went on after this to link up with Fuji to produce another really strange-looking camera that had all sorts of whiz things on it. But if you wanted a digital SLR, you could have that for £20,000. So not a good idea. The one that really sort of was the breakthrough was the Nikon D1, because this was the first digital SLR to be built but from the ground up by a single manufacturer. Not necessarily as a digital camera as such, because it still took the old Nikon F mount, or variation of it, but it was actually the first all-one company producer, that's the Nikon D1. That was 1999. That was 2.7 megapixel, I think. But the important thing is they got the price in under £3,000. And so it wasn't really a camera for amateurs, but it's a camera that professionals could use, and did.
It kind of started the digital SLR revolution.
I think it really did. It really did. I mean, a little while later, the D70 came in at under £1,000, and that was probably the first one which appealed to amateurs.
Yeah, and the Canon 3 and
all that. So there you are. So that's probably the real starting point for DSLRs, and the ending point here, I guess.
Lovely, yes.
Because we're not going into digital in too much.
We're not going to go into this. We're sticking to the 20th century.
We are indeed. So it's 1999, so we just made it.
Yeah. And we will look at 21st century, the rise of digital cameras and the landmark cameras of the 21st century in another video. But right now, this is a good place to end this. So this has been a fascinating journey. And this period of time from the end of the war to the 20th, it's seen incredible change.
Yeah.
Cameras have evolved incredibly and diversified incredibly. So you tell us what you think about these cameras. Tell us what your favourites are. Which ones would you like to own? Which ones have you owned maybe? And perhaps you've had some of these cameras. And I hope you enjoyed the video. Do like the video and subscribe to the channel if you don't already. And I'll see you in the next video.